In 209 BCE, the 26-year-old Roman commander Publius Cornelius Scipio stood before the seemingly impregnable walls of Carthago Nova, the strategic heart of Carthaginian power in Iberia. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down how one untried commander solved an impossible military equation, utilizing vital local intelligence, a bizarre geographical anomaly, and a vanguard of exactly 500 men to crack Carthage's greatest stronghold and permanently shift the balance of the ancient world. A bitter wind swept off the Mediterranean Sea across the narrow, rocky isthmus, highlighting the sheer geographic isolation of the fortress. This was a city built to be unconquerable, surrounded by deep water on 3 sides and defended by massive stone bulwarks on the 4th. Rome was steadily losing the Second Punic War. Our Hannibal Barca was deeply entrenched in Italy, bleeding the Republic dry and shattering its legions in the field. In a calculated risk, the Roman Senate had dispatched Scipio with an expeditionary force of 27,500 troops, far behind enemy lines. His objective presented a logistical impossibility. A conventional siege of Carthago Nova would dictate months of slow, grinding attrition, but Scipio was operating against a rapidly closing timetable. He had only a matter of days before 3 massive Carthaginian field armies, currently dispersed across the peninsula, would catch wind of his maneuver, converge, and crush his legions against the sea. Scipio was trapped in a lethal tactical paradox. If he bypassed the city, the enemy's economic engine would continue to fund Hannibal's war machine. If he assaulted it directly, he risked seeing his own army shattered against an impenetrable wall. To survive, he had to take the fortress immediately. To understand the desperation of Scipio's gamble, one must look at the devastating Roman collapse 2 years prior. In 211 BCE, the Roman war effort in the Iberian Peninsula was effectively annihilated at the Battle of the Upper Baetis. Scipio's own father and uncle, who had commanded the theater for years, were outmaneuvered, isolated, and killed in action. The destruction of their armies forced the surviving remnants of the Roman legions to retreat north, completely abandoning all territorial gains south of the Ebro River. This was not merely a loss of land. It was a crippling strategic blow. Iberia was the economic engine of the Carthaginian Empire. Its silver mines funded mercenary contracts. One and its fiercely independent tribes provided the heavy infantry and swift cavalry that kept Hannibal's war machine operating on Italian soil. With Rome pushed to the northern fringes of the peninsula, Carthage was free to exploit these resources unchecked. Back in Rome, the Senate faced a severe shortage of veteran commanders. A generation of magistrates and consuls, along with over 80,000 regular troops, had already been slaughtered by Hannibal at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. Sending another massive consular army to Iberia meant stripping the Italian defenses, yet leaving the peninsula in Carthaginian hands guaranteed Rome's eventual financial and military strangulation. In this atmosphere of institutional exhaustion, the Senate took an unprecedented political risk. They granted proconsular imperium, supreme military authority, usually reserved for former consuls, to the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, a man who had never held top executive office. This was a decision born of absolute necessity, not a belief in divine destiny. The Republic simply had no other viable candidates willing to take command of a broken theater. Scipio was given a mandate to restore the Ebro frontier, but he understood the cold mathematics of the conflict far better than his political superiors. Upon arriving in Iberia, the newly appointed proconsul assessed a grim tactical landscape. The Carthaginian forces were split into 3 separate field armies, commanded by Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and Hasdrubal Gisco. Together, they vastly outnumbered his expeditionary force, If Scipio marched out to engage them in a conventional campaign, the enemy commanders would inevitably combine their strength and crush his legions through sheer numerical superiority. Furthermore, chasing these armies across the rugged interior of the peninsula would stretch Roman supply lines to the breaking point. Scipio realized that playing a defensive game along the frontier would only delay the inevitable destruction of his army. He had his command, but to save Rome, he could not simply fight the Carthaginians in the open field. He had to strike directly at their heart, a target no one believed could be taken. The target Scipio selected for this decisive strike was Carthago Nova. To the Carthaginian Empire, this settlement was far more than a mere provincial capital. It was the central nervous system of their entire operation in Iberia. Behind its imposing walls lay the imperial treasury, filled with silver to pay mercenary contracts, alongside massive stockpiles of grain, artillery, and siege equipment. It also served as the primary naval base, facilitating communication and reinforcement between North Africa and the European theater. Yet its most valuable asset was political. The city housed hundreds of high-ranking hostages taken from various Iberian tribes, held by Carthage to guarantee the continued loyalty and military support of the local populations. Capturing Carthago Nova would therefore achieve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. It would bankrupt the enemy war effort, cripple their supply chain, and immediately destabilize the fragile network of alliances that provided Hannibal with his infantry. This audacious plan relied heavily on precise intelligence and a ruthless exploitation of enemy complacency. Through local informants, Scipio learned the exact disposition of the three Carthaginian field commanders, Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and Hasdrubal Gisco, were campaigning in widely separated regions, suppressing revolts and securing territory. Scipio determined that the closest Carthaginian force was positioned at least 10 days' march from the capital. He calculated that if his legions moved with unprecedented speed, they could isolate the city, storm its defenses, and secure the fortress before any relief force could be mobilized. However, this strategy carried a catastrophic all-or-nothing risk. By deliberately bypassing the enemy armies and extending his lines of communication, Scipio was advancing his 27,500 troops entirely without a tactical safety net. If his assault stalled for even a week, his legions would be pinned against the sea, caught in a fatal vice between the heavily fortified walls of the city and the crushing weight of three converging Carthaginian armies. In such a scenario, there would be no avenue for a retreat, and Rome would lose its final army in the west. To execute this maneuver, the Roman commander demanded an exhausting pace from his men. Leaving a minimal garrison to protect his northern base at Tarraco, Scipio drove his main force south down the rugged Mediterranean coastline. The march was a masterpiece of logistical discipline, maintaining a grueling momentum marked by the relentless and rhythmic crunch of iron-studded sandals against the dry coastal dirt as the column pressed forward under the intense Iberian sun. To protect his vulnerable seaward flank and guarantee rapid resupply, he synchronized this overland advance with a Roman fleet commanded by his trusted subordinate, Gaius Laelius. The naval squadron shadowed the army down the coast, prepared to blockade the harbor the moment the infantry secured the landward approaches. The strategic logic was flawless, but realizing it meant overcoming an obstacle that military engineers deemed impossible to breach in a matter of days. Mago, the Carthaginian garrison commander, did not passively wait for the Romans to organize their siege works. Sensing the vulnerability of Scipio's compressed formations on the narrow isthmus, Mago ordered a preemptive sally. He sent his 2,000 armed citizens charging out of the eastern gates to disrupt the Roman deployment. The resulting clash was a brutal infantry engagement, confined within a severely restricted tactical space. Because the land bridge was so narrow, Scipio could not deploy his superior numbers in a broad line to outflank the attackers. Instead, the Roman vanguard had to absorb the initial Carthaginian shock head-on. However, the superior discipline and equipment of the Roman heavy infantry quickly asserted dominance. After a sharp, intense struggle, the Carthaginian citizens broke and fled back toward the gates. In their panic to retreat inside, the crush of bodies at the narrow entrance resulted in heavy casualties, nearly allowing the pursuing Romans to breach the city right then and there. With the defenders driven back behind their fortifications, Scipio immediately escalated the pressure. He ordered a general assault on the eastern wall. Roman legionaries advanced under a heavy barrage, raising massive scaling ladders against the towering stone defenses. The tactical friction of the environment instantly became apparent. The sheer height of the walls meant that the ladders were inherently unstable, and the narrow front severely restricted Roman maneuverability. Carthaginian defenders, securely positioned on the high battlements, rained down a concentrated deadly crossfire of javelins, rocks, and heavy projectiles. The physical reality of the assault was grueling. The splintering crack of heavy wooden ladders breaking under the weight of armored men and falling stones punctuated the organized chaos of the Roman advance. Despite their renowned discipline, the legionaries were being stalled in a funnel of concentrated missile fire. Rather than leading from the front and risking the entire campaign on a stray javelin, Scipio maintained strict operational control from an elevated, protected vantage point at the rear of the isthmus. This positioning allowed him an unobstructed view of the tactical breakdown at the walls. He recognized that a breakthrough on the eastern front was impossible under the current conditions. However, he did not halt the attack. Instead, he instituted a systematic rotation of his troops, pulling battered cohorts back and immediately sending fresh reserves forward to resume the assault. This relentless cycle of attack and reinforcement served a specific, calculated purpose. It forced Mago to commit every available defender, including his elite Carthaginian regulars, to the eastern wall to prevent a breach. The garrison was being systematically exhausted, completely fixated on the visible threat directly in front of them. The Roman casualties mounted by the hour, and the siege equipment continued to shatter against the impenetrable stone. From the battlements, the defenders fought with increasing confidence, believing they were successfully bleeding the Roman army dry on the rocks of the isthmus. To the Carthaginian commander, the Roman strategy looked like a desperate, bloody failure, but he did not realize he was playing exactly the role Scipio had written for him. While the Carthaginian garrison poured their energy into defending the isthmus, they remained completely unaware that Scipio possessed critical intelligence regarding the local topography. Months prior, while still stationed at his northern headquarters in Tarraco, the Roman commander had systematically interrogated local fishermen who worked the waters around Carthago Nova. He sought any structural or geographical weakness in the peninsula's defenses, knowing that a direct siege against properly supplied walls was mathematical suicide. What he discovered was not a flaw in Carthaginian engineering, but a vulnerability dictated by the environment itself. The expansive lagoon bordering the northern edge of the city, on which Mago trusted as an impenetrable barrier, was not a deep-water basin. It was a shallow tidal estuary subject to extreme predictable fluctuations. According to the local fishermen, a specific meteorological alignment would occasionally drain the lagoon almost completely. If a standard evening ebb tide coincided with a strong, sustained wind blowing off the land, the sheer atmospheric pressure would push the shallow water outward into the Mediterranean. This natural phenomenon would expose the muddy floor of the basin, creating a temporary fordable path stretching directly to the city's northern flank. Scipio had orchestrated the entire bloody frontal assault on the eastern walls to serve this exact environmental clock, and he needed to fix Mago's attention and siphon his reserves away from the water while he waited for the wind to change. To ensure his soldiers would willingly march into a seemingly treacherous body of water, Scipio weaponized Roman religion. He announced to his legions that the sea god Neptune had appeared to him in a dream, promising to intervene and open a miraculous path. By translating a calculated meteorological prediction into a divine mandate, he secured the fearless momentum of his troops. As late afternoon transitioned into evening, the environmental conditions aligned precisely as Scipio had anticipated. The tide began to recede, and a fierce wind swept across the peninsula, visibly accelerating the drainage of the northern basin. The water level plummeted rapidly, leaving behind a vast expanse of exposed seabed. Recognizing his window had opened, Scipio detached a specialized vanguard of exactly 500 hand-picked legionaries equipped with scaling ladders. Their target was the northern wall of Carthago Nova. Because Carthaginian military architects had always relied on the lagoon acting as an impassable natural moat, they had built the fortifications along this sector significantly lower and with far fewer defensive emplacements than the towering eastern bulwarks. More importantly, Mago's desperate defense of the isthmus had stripped this northern sector of all its sentries. Every available combatant had been rotated to the main gate to survive the relentless Roman pressure. The Roman detachment left the safety of the shoreline and stepped into the exposed basin. The physical execution of this maneuver was grueling, and the vanguard faced the sheer exhaustion of wading waist-deep through the dense, sucking mud of the draining lagoon, fighting for every step as the freezing wind howled across the remaining dark water. Yet, this geographical anomaly provided absolute tactical concealment. The noise of the howling gale, combined with the continuous roar of artillery and clashing shields echoing from the eastern gates, completely masked the sound of the vanguard's agonizing advance. The Carthaginian defenders, exhausted and fixated entirely on the Roman cohorts grinding against their front door, remained oblivious to the fact that their impregnable natural defense had just evaporated. The 500 legionaries reached the base of the northern wall undetected, but if the wind shifted or the tide returned too soon, and they would be swallowed by the lagoon before they even drew their swords. The vanguard planted their ladders against the low, unmanned masonry of the northern sector. Because Mago had redirected every available sentry to hold the isthmus, the 500 Romans scaled the defenses without a single javelin or stone cast in their direction. Once over the parapets, the mechanical breakdown of the Carthaginian defense was instantaneous and catastrophic. The fortress had been explicitly designed to repel an army attacking from the land bridge, leaving its internal layout highly vulnerable to an enemy already inside the walls. The legionaries did not break formation to loot the wealthy districts directly below them. Maintaining absolute tactical discipline, they advanced swiftly along the elevated battlements, or their sole objective was the heavily fortified eastern gates, where the main Roman army remained engaged in a grinding battle of attrition against the Carthaginian garrison. Sweeping down the interior staircases, the Roman detachment struck the rear of the Carthaginian defenders, holding the eastern gate. The tactical shock was total. Men who had been fighting desperately against the frontal assault suddenly found themselves flanked and cut down from behind by heavy infantry. Within minutes, the massive iron-reinforced timber doors were unbarred from the inside and thrown wide open, exposing the city's heart. Scipio's main force, having awaited this exact moment under the cover of their shields, flooded into the city in a relentless, ordered wave. The Roman advance through the breach was not the chaotic rush of a bloodthirsty mob, but the systematic, ruthless execution of a military machine. Centurions directed cohorts in precise formations, aggressively clearing major thoroughfares and securing vital intersections to ensure the Carthaginian garrison could not rally and mount an organized counterattack in the narrow streets. Realizing his seemingly impregnable fortress had been fatally compromised, Mago recognized that the lower city was entirely lost. He abandoned the shattered eastern defenses and ordered an immediate retreat, pulling his surviving regular troops back into the elevated fortified citadel to mount a final desperate stand. Down in the avenues below, Standard Roman military doctrine dictated a brutal but calculated protocol for taking a city by storm. Before organized looting could commence, the primary objective was absolute pacification, to eliminate any possibility of a civilian uprising or urban guerrilla resistance in their rear. The legions systematically neutralized any armed or mobile presence encountered in the streets. This was a grim operational necessity, executed without emotion, designed to paralyze the remaining population with terror until the entire defensive perimeter was decisively secured. The legions pushed relentlessly upward through the city sectors, driving the remaining defenders before them until the Roman standard was planted directly outside the gates of the citadel. The geographical and structural advantage of Carthago Nova had been completely dismantled in a matter of hours. The city had fallen, but capturing the streets was only the first phase, or how Scipio managed the aftermath would determine whether Rome won a battle or won the entire continent. As the Roman standard rose outside the citadel gates, Mago recognized the futility of further resistance. The Carthaginian commander formally surrendered his remaining regulars to Scipio, effectively ending the battle for Carthago Nova. It was at this precise moment that Scipio demonstrated a level of command control rarely seen in ancient warfare. Instead of allowing the sack to devolve into days of unchecked looting and slaughter, he issued an absolute order to halt all killing. The sharp, piercing blast of the Roman horn echoed over the urban sprawl, signaling the immediate cessation of violence. The legions, operating with terrifying mechanical discipline, transitioned instantly from assault troops to an occupying garrison. This cold efficiency was not driven by altruism, but by strict tactical pragmatism. Scipio needed the city's infrastructure and its surviving population intact to serve as Rome's new operational hub. With the streets secured, Roman quartermasters began cataloging the staggering wealth of the Carthaginian Empire. The capture yielded massive quantities of silver bullion, 63 merchant vessels in the harbor, 400 catapults, and grain reserves sufficient to feed the Roman expeditionary force for months. Yet, the most critical asset secured was not metal or machinery, but human capital. Within the governor's palace, Scipio took custody of hundreds of high-ranking hostages, the wives, children, and heirs of the most powerful Iberian chieftains. Carthage had held these families captive to extort military compliance from the local tribes, ensuring a steady stream of heavy infantry and cavalry for Hannibal's campaigns in Italy. Conventional military practice dictated that a victorious general would either enslave these captives or hold them for massive ransoms to fund his own war effort. Scipio, however, executed a geopolitical masterstroke that dismantled the foundation of Carthaginian power in the West. He summoned the terrified hostages, treated them with immense dignity, and announced that they were free to return to their homes without demanding a single coin in ransom. He deliberately presented the Roman Republic not as a new conqueror, but as a liberator. This calculated act of clemency resonated across the peninsula faster than any marching army. By returning the heirs of the tribal nobility, Scipio instantly flipped the allegiance of dozens of independent Iberian factions. The local chieftains, no longer bound by Carthaginian extortion, began to pledge their warriors to the Roman cause. In a single afternoon, Scipio had severed Carthage from its primary source of mercenary manpower, transferring that exact military capacity directly to his own legions. The wealth of Carthago Nova was now in Roman hands, leaving the three Carthaginian field armies politically isolated and logistically starved on a hostile peninsula. The fall of Carthago Nova was not merely a territorial acquisition. It was a devastating logistical decapitation that reconfigured the entire Mediterranean theater. Without the silver bullion from the municipal treasury and the crucial maritime lifeline to North Africa, the Carthaginian Senate could no longer efficiently sustain its war effort in Iberia, let alone marshal the resources to resupply Hannibal Barca across the Alps. The vast stockpile of captured artillery, weapons, and grain was immediately repurposed by Roman quartermasters, transforming Scipio's previously vulnerable expeditionary force into a heavily armed, self-sustaining juggernaut operating deep within enemy territory. More significantly, the siege fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the Second Punic War. Before 209 BCE, Rome had spent nearly a decade defensively reacting to Carthaginian brilliance, its military class practically paralyzed by the catastrophic slaughter at Cannae. Scipio shattered that defensive paradigm. By synthesizing meticulous intelligence gathering, in an acute awareness of environmental anomalies, and absolute command discipline under pressure, he proved that Roman legions could outmaneuver Carthaginian strongholds rather than simply outsuffer them in the field. He emerged from the fading smoke of the conquered city, not just as a competent magistrate, but as an intellectual and strategic peer to Hannibal himself. The tactical and political framework Scipio forged on the Iberian coast became the explicit blueprint for ultimate Roman victory. The seamless integration of land and naval forces, the ruthless weaponization of local tribal alliances to strip the enemy of their cavalry, and the cold calculation of his post-war diplomacy seen at Carthago Nova would be replicated on a massive scale 7 years later, or when Scipio crossed into North Africa and decisively defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. He employed the exact strategic doctrine he had first perfected while staring down the formidable stone walls of the Spanish peninsula. The assault on Carthago Nova endures as one of the most brilliant, high-stakes surgical strikes in ancient military history. It remains a definitive testament to how speed, actionable intelligence, and a precisely timed vanguard of 500 men can paralyze an overwhelming enemy force and dismantle the infrastructure of an empire. If you want to delve deeper into the decisive tactical turning points of antiquity and continue to explore the great chapters of warfare with us, subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.